Hello and welcome to a very brief video in which I summarise the discussion between Professor Vivian Lowndes and Nigel Kletz from the Birmingham City Council on the topic of markets in practice. So in the first video, introducing Birmingham and Nigel Kletz, Nigel talked about the fact that Birmingham as a city in the West Midlands of the United Kingdom has a population of just over 1 million people, which makes it the largest local authority in all of Europe, which might sound a bit odd, but to put things in context, the Greater London Authority is not one single local authority, it's several local authorities combined, whereas the West Midlands Combined Authority, which is the proper name for the Birmingham City Council, is a combination of is the largest authority in all of Europe. It's also highly multicultural. In particular, there are several citizens who come from India and Pakistan and have heritage from all over the world. It has a high number of it has a number of challenges, mostly on the topics of high deprivation and areas of high unemployment. The council is then focused on 4 aspects, which is children, which involves the improving education and safeguarding, housing, responding to the housing needs, health and well-being, particularly of the elderly, and the growth of the local economy. In terms of the additional challenges, though, and ones that we're particularly concerned with, the budget has shrunk. So traditional income sources are from central government, but this has been cut significantly since 2012. Roughly 50% of discretionary spending has been reduced. Now, just to make clear what we're talking about here, discretionary spending refers to spending that is non-essential. So these are services that the council does which are not essential to council operations. So essential council operations might be things like the delivery of bus services, the collection of bins, and so on. And this discretionary spending has been the primary focus of cuts. Most income, however, still comes from central government, and there are other sources. So for instance, 9% comes from council tax, and roughly 27% comes from local tax receipts. And one area of focus that Birmingham City Council has looked at is the use of the market to address budgetary and financial pressures. And this is where Nigel's role is particularly important. So Nigel is the commissioning and procurement manager, and in that he's typically concerned with commissioning, the procurement process, managing the council contracts in place, which involves, and I thought this was quite interesting, social values. So this isn't just a case of using businesses to deliver services, but to deliver the social values that the local council wants to prioritise. And this is, broadly speaking, the commissioning and procurement process. But as well, part of Nigel's role, and perhaps probably the more informal part of his role, or should we say broader but less specific, is the enabling of the council to be more commercial. I thought it was particularly interesting that Nigel talked about the fact that his background was not in local government, but in procurement. Okay, so he is not a local government specialist. He comes from the private sector, where his specialty was in the very things that he now specialises in council. That was the end of the first video, which leads to video 2, and the question of the commissioning cycle. So what is commissioning? How is it understood? Nigel made the point that this word means different things to different people, which is a fair comment. So, with that in mind, Birmingham City Council has put a commissioning strategy in place that defines commissioning and creates a structure for its use. what does it look like? Commissioning asks, first of all, what outcomes are we seeking? Okay, so what do we want to achieve? And second of all, with that in mind, how should it be delivered? So what outcomes are we seeking and how should that be delivered? Typically, the question of how should that be delivered involves considering the desired outcomes, the budgetary constraints, so what's the available money, and the methods of delivery. One thing that Vivian asked Nigel was, is the presumption that the market is the best method for value? Or sorry, to be more specific, Vivian's question was, is the presumption that the council is not the best method for delivery? And Nigel responded saying, the presumption's really that the best method for value is pursued. So it's not necessarily that the council is not good and that the market is better. It's the question of what is the best method for achieving value in delivery. And Birmingham City Council, as a result, is actually in a position now where several different services have been delivered by the market. To reiterate the point in the previous slide, Nigel says the focus has to be on outcomes. What do we want to achieve, and who is best placed to deliver that? And then they moved on to talk about the commissioning cycle, and this is what's known as the analyse, plan, do, review. Okay, so start off with the analyse. Why? We need to consider what outcomes we want to achieve. What benefits do we want alongside this? What are the needs of citizens and clients? And what's the overall council strategic priorities that maybe limits some of the other answers? Once that's been identified, the commissioning cycle moves on to the planning, which is how they ask what will be done. So they look at the resources they have, as well as the funding and the costs and the income that might come from this, the outputs and the products, so again, sort of connected to outcomes, but more concretely what products will be delivered, and the internal and the external considerations and constraints. Then they start to put this in place. So this is the do. How? This is the question of delivery. So actually delivering the services. Evaluate whether this is going according to plan. And implementation. Has the implementation been correct? And then the review. And that's essentially, and this is important, why it's a cycle. Because at the end of the review stage, you might then need to analyse again and restart the process. Which brings us to video 3. And video 3 talked about the different methods of service delivery. So Nigel went through each of these in detail, but again, let's just keep them summarised here. He said there are 13 different service delivery options, but broadly speaking, they fall into different categories. 7 different categories. The first is a simple, we no longer do it. So the service is no longer provided by the council. Second is we continue to do it, in which case the council keeps doing the service and keeps it in-house. Those are the two simplest answers. The third is to give it to someone else, and this is the outsourcing or the contracting of services. The fourth one is particularly interesting. We create a new entity to do it. So this might be the case that the government, the local government, sets up a private business in which they look for investment, they look for staff, they look for funding, and they look for infrastructure and all these sorts of things that then takes on the delivery of that service. The fifth is we share doing it with someone else. So this is a collaborative arrangement, generally with another public body. So it might not even be the market. It might well be different local councils or different district councils working together for a collaborative approach. Similarly, but importantly distinct, is to join with someone else to do it. This is essentially a constructing or contracting of a framework created by another body. And finally, a mixture. So one thing that was really interesting in the video was Nigel talked about the fact that in Birmingham there are a lot of public parks, and Birmingham is quite well known for having a lot of public parks, and a combination of methods are used to maintain the parks because, for instance, the groundskeepers might be employed directly by the council, but the collection of bins might be a private service, and so on. Video 4 started with Vivian asking, so this is all very interesting, what can go wrong? What are the issues in public service delivery? Nigel said, well, as far as these relationships are complex and multi-layered, there are two main problems that that local councils have to be conscious of. And the first is reputation, which is absolutely key. So even if the service is outsourced, it is the council's reputation that is in citizens' minds. Now, this is something that I think is quite important to bear in mind. Typically in Britain, for instance, the collection of bins can be outsourced, right? So your average waste bin is collected by a private company. But I know that when I think about who collects my bins, I'm usually thinking of Birmingham City Council, because the original need for the service comes from the council. It doesn't come from the market. And in that regard, as Nigel says, and this is, I think, a nice summary, you can outsource the cost of running the service and the risks that are involved with that service, but one thing that you cannot outsource is reputation. Reputation is always going to be yours. The other concern is supplier performance. So this affects reputation, okay? But the problem is, what if suppliers don't perform as well as they should? So one thing that Nigel talked about was contingency plans. He says that in Birmingham City Council, many of the services they've outsourced have contingency plans in place, so that if the supplier fails, they can quickly shift to either, again, insourcing, taking back control of the service at local government level, or perhaps even more simply, just getting someone else to do it. This might be the case when, for example, a company goes bankrupt. If these two are not handled well, the local government can suffer, even if the local government was not responsible for the failure. And that led us to video 5. What's the future of public service management? What's it going to look like? So, bearing in mind, Vivian was recording this video toward the end of the end of the 2010s, and she was curious what impact austerity and spending cuts have had on the provision of services. So the first is, that Nigel says, it forced organisations to look at their delivery capacity. The first stage of the commissioning process is relevant here. The question is asked, what can be delivered? What is discretionary versus necessary? So essentially, we're going through a period of tight financial restraint. What services can we do without? And what's necessary? But of course, this leads to a knock-on effect, because once you identify which services are going to be delivered, you then have to ask, who delivers these services? Does that require reconsideration? Nigel then asked, or responded to the question of, will councils use markets more? He made it very clear, and I thought this was really interesting, that this is still a public body political decision. Each individual local council is going to make this decision separately, according to their own needs. And I think it's important to point out that he did say it's a political decision. It might well be that some local councils don't go with the cheapest option, they go with the most politically convenient option. In Birmingham City Council, he talked about the fact that a lot of decommissioning and then reviewing has taken place for most services, and some have even been insourced. So it might be the case that a few years ago, for instance, buses were provided by private services, and now they're provided by Birmingham City Council again. But, and I think this is important, Nigel said it is probably still going to be a mixed approach on an individual case-by-case basis. There's not going to be a wholesale outsourcing or wholesale insourcing of relevant public services. So, that's everything from me. I hope this video has been a quick help in preparing to understand the commissioning and procurement process, and I'll see you all in the seminars. Thank you.